He was tying his navy blue tie ready to see his son for dinner when his lawyer's text slashed through the silence like a blade. "Call me immediately." In that instant, the warmth of family tradition collapsed into cold terror, and what should have been a simple evening became the start of a nightmare. The audience can feel his chest tighten, the familiar comfort of home turning into a stage for betrayal. What truth could possibly be so urgent that it tears a father from his routine and hurls him into fear? Subscribe now, and comment where you're watching from before the next revelation unfolds. The father stood in front of the mirror, the dim light glinting off the silver threads woven into his navy tie. His fingers worked slowly, steadying the Windsor knot with a precision born from years of repetition, but the movement was not mechanical. Each tug of fabric carried a weight of memory. That tie had been a gift from his late wife, wrapped in soft tissue paper, and presented with a smile that crinkled the edges of her eyes. She had laughed when she held it up to his chest, teasing him that the silver would catch the gray in his hair. Now, 2 years after she was lowered into the ground, the tie felt like a relic of her touch, a fragile tether to a life that had slipped away. The house around him was too quiet, too large, filled with echoes of a family that no longer lived there. The oak floors beneath his polished shoes creaked softly each step, reminding him of the renovations he and his wife had done together. The scent of cedar still lingered faintly from the closet where his suits had hung for decades. He straightened a silver-framed photograph on the entryway table, his late wife's face frozen in a moment of joy, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a long-ago snapshot. He whispered to her as he always did before leaving, promising to tell her later about his grandson's soccer game, as if the walls might carry his words to wherever she had gone. Friday dinners with his son had become his last ritual of connection, the thread keeping him from unraveling completely. He had made it a rule never to show up looking careless, never to appear like an old man fading into irrelevance. Tonight, like every other week, he wore his charcoal gray suit jacket pressed and sharp. He wanted his son to see not just a father, but a man who still mattered, a man who still belonged. As he reached for the jacket, his phone buzzed on the polished wood of the table. He expected a message from his son about dessert, maybe a reminder to bring a bottle of wine. Instead, the name on the screen froze him in place. His lawyer, a man he had trusted for 3 decades, had sent a message short and sharp: "Call me immediately." His stomach clenched as he tapped the number. His lawyer's voice came through low and controlled, carrying a weight that tightened the father's chest. He was told not to go anywhere, to sit down and prepare himself. What followed cracked the world he thought he knew. He sank onto the bench by the door, still holding his jacket, listening as his lawyer's voice stripped away the fabric of his life. The accounts he believed secure the retirement funds he had built over decades were nearly gone. The reports he had received every quarter were forgeries. The money, his life's work, had been drained in secret. His heart pounded in his ears, the blood rushing so loudly he almost missed the most devastating truth. The only person with the legal power to access those funds was his son, the very man he was about to join for dinner. The house seemed to tilt around him. Memories once warm now warped into something sinister. He remembered his son's reassuring smile at the kitchen table a year earlier, telling him not to worry, that the market was volatile, that he would handle the logistics. Those words that had comforted him then now cut like blades. His lawyer's warning rang in his ear: "Do not reveal what you know. Go to dinner, smile, pretend." If his son suspected anything, the last of the money could vanish, buried beyond reach. He rose slowly and walked back to the mirror. The man staring at him looked older than he had that morning. His eyes were wide, shadowed by betrayal. But somewhere deep beneath the pain, something stirred. He was an engineer by trade, a builder of bridges, a man who understood structures. A structure had been compromised, its foundation rotted by greed, and now it was time to study the damage. He pulled on the gray jacket, smoothed the lapels, and whispered into the empty air, "The performance begins now." The drive to his son's house cut through neighborhoods lined with manicured lawns and towering oaks. Each passing home was a monument to security, stability, permanence. But the largest house on the block, glowing with modern glass and white stone, now seemed like a monument to deceit. As the gate slid open, he forced a smile across his face. His son's embrace was practiced, his words warm on the surface, but to the father they landed like claims of ownership. Inside, the luxury screamed louder than any greeting. Italian marble floors gleamed, chandeliers blazed overhead, the scent of lilies and cedarwood perfumed the air. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also built on the ruins of his future. The son's wife swept into the room, elegant in cream silk, her jewelry catching the light with a sharp glint. She wrapped her arms around him in an embrace so shallow it might as well have been scripted. Her voice dripped with polished concern, asking if he was tired, studying his face like a doctor searching for weakness. He answered carefully, masking the storm inside. Every detail of the home struck him harder. The sapphire ring on her finger, the massive painting on the wall, the Porsche parked outside, all paid for with money stolen from him. Dinner became a theater of deception. They asked about his week, feigning interest, but the conversation always returned to their projects, their trips, their plans. At one point his son leaned forward, voice soft with concern, suggesting a change in investment strategy. The father nearly laughed at the audacity. The thief was offering to protect him from the volatility he himself had created. But he remembered his lawyer's warning, and he played the part of the grateful aging man who trusted his children completely. He nodded, offered gentle praise, and watched his son relax, convinced his crime remained hidden. He left that night carrying the weight of betrayal in silence. But as he drove back through the quiet streets, he felt a new clarity settle in his chest. The performance would continue, but underneath it he would begin to build. His life had been dismantled piece by piece, but he still had the mind of an engineer, a man who knew that even collapsed structures could become the foundation for something new. The next morning he met his lawyer in a room that smelled of old paper and coffee, the air thick with determination. A forensic accountant was introduced, a young woman whose eyes missed nothing. She had already begun tracing the stolen funds, connecting them to shell companies and risky developments managed by his son-in-law. The evidence was damning. What had been presented as success was in fact a desperate attempt to funnel stolen money into a failing enterprise. His son and daughter-in-law were gambling with his future, and they were losing. The plan was laid out with clinical precision. He was to continue his performance as the weary father, confused by paperwork, reliant on his son's guidance. He would even plant seeds of weakness, feigning forgetfulness, allowing his children to believe their control was absolute. Arrogance, his lawyer explained, was the greatest weakness of all. If they believed him broken, they would overreach. And when they did, the trap would snap shut. The father agreed, though every word tasted like ash. To pretend to be weaker than he was, to let his son believe the theft was still hidden, was a torment almost worse than the betrayal itself. But he endured it because endurance was what fathers did. He had endured decades of work, endured the loss of his wife, endured the loneliness of an empty house. He could endure this too. As days passed, he rehearsed his role with painful care. A sigh here, a misplaced wallet there, small performances designed to reinforce his children's belief that they held all the power. He even shared a casual conversation with an old friend at a diner, carefully leaking the idea that he might sell his house and move to a retirement community. He knew his words would travel quickly, that the rumor would reach the ears it was meant for. That evening when his son called, panic laced every syllable. The house could not be sold. He insisted, not yet, not ever. His son's wife layered on the sentiment, speaking of memories of family history, of his late wife's touch, still present in every corner of the home. But beneath the rehearsed emotion, he could hear the fear, the desperation. He listened, offered vague promises, and hung up the phone with a grim smile. He sat in the quiet of his house, the soup on his table growing cold, and knew the trap had been set. His son, blinded by greed and arrogance, had already stepped into it. The father's heart still ached with the wound of betrayal, but beneath the pain burned something steadier. The war had begun, and this time he was ready. And as the night closed in around him, one question lingered in the silence, pressing against the edges of his thoughts. When the final mask falls and his son's lies collapse in full view, what will be left of the family they once were? The father moved slowly through the cavernous rooms of his house, each step landing heavy on oak floors that once carried the weight of running children and his wife's careful touch. The walls, painted in soft cream years earlier, now seemed to echo only silence, the kind that pressed in on him until it felt like a second skin. He paused in the living room where sunlight still filtered through lace curtains she had chosen, and he could almost hear the faint hum of her voice. For a fleeting moment, the room seemed alive again. The smell of Sunday roasts, the thud of a basketball hitting the hallway wall, his son's laughter bouncing against the ceiling beams. But the ghosts vanished with a blink, leaving nothing but dust motes swirling in the late afternoon light. The house was large, too large for a man alone. 5 bedrooms stretched empty, stripped of the clutter that once defined them. One still held the faded mural of spaceships and planets he had painted for his son when he was 7. The colors now cracked and peeling. He touched the wall fingers, brushing over the outline of a rocket ship, and felt a hollow ache rise in his chest. He remembered the night he stayed up until 2 in the morning painting it, his wife bringing him coffee, whispering that their boy would wake to magic. That boy had grown into a man who no longer needed magic-only money. The irony was bitter enough to taste. He entered the dining room and stared at the long mahogany table polished to a dull shine. Holidays had once stretched across its surface, filled with carved turkeys, pies cooling near the window, and wine glasses clinking with toasts. Now the table was bare, except for a single envelope resting near the center, a reminder from the bank, though not addressed to him but to his son, who had insisted on managing the financial affairs. His stomach twisted as he read the cold print balances, deadlines, interest rates, all written as though the empire he had built was nothing more than an account to be harvested. The silence in the house was not just quiet, it was accusatory. Every corner seemed to demand why he still trusted, why he had given so freely, why he had ignored the small signs, his son's reluctance to look him in the eye, the growing luxury cars in the driveway of a house he did not own, the hollow words of gratitude that felt more like rehearsed lines. He sat heavily in the armchair by the fireplace, the same chair where his grandson had curled in his lap, listening to stories of cowboys and soldiers. The cushions sagged now, still imprinted with the weight of memory. He closed his eyes and the emptiness sharpened. Pride and emptiness wrestled inside him, each memory of accomplishment soured by the knowledge of betrayal. He had built this house from the ground up, each beam a testament to his years of labor, his sweat, his ambition. And yet, he could feel the walls shifting against him, as though the home itself anticipated its theft, prepared to pass into hands that had not earned it. As night began to fall, he rose and moved to the upstairs hallway, where framed photographs lined the walls like silent witnesses. His wedding portrait, his wife radiant in white lace. His son at 12 holding a baseball bat, grinning with crooked teeth. A family trip to the Grand Canyon, the desert sky endless above them. He trailed a finger along the glass of each frame, his reflection staring back like a stranger. The faces looking out at him were reminders not of joy, but of what had been squandered. The silence thickened until it became unbearable. He went into his wife's old room, untouched since her passing, where her perfume still lingered faintly in the closet. He sat on the edge of the bed and bent forward, his hands clutching the sheets as if he could hold on to her through fabric. He whispered that he was sorry, though he could not name exactly what for, sorry for not seeing sooner, sorry for letting their son walk this path unchecked, sorry for still hoping that the boy she had adored might redeem himself. His chest tightened, and he stayed there until the shadow swallowed the room. Downstairs, the grandfather clock ticked louder in the silence, marking each second like a hammer against his ribs. He rose, the sound driving him back into the present, into the reality that what he cherished was under siege. Pride still pulsed in him, a reminder of everything he had built, but emptiness clung to him too. whispering that it could all vanish if he did not act. The contrast was unbearable. The man who had once been master of his home, now walking through its halls like an intruder in his own life. He stopped at the front window, looking out onto the street where the glow of neighbors' lamps dotted the evening. Other families gathered, other homes alive with voices, laughter, routine. His house stood dark, looming a shell of what it had been. The pride he once felt showing it off at barbecues had curdled into shame. He imagined the gossip if the truth became public, if people learned he had been stripped not by strangers, but by his own blood. That humiliation burned hotter than the silence. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and let the memory of his wife's laughter wash over him one last time before pulling away. He told himself there would be no more illusions, no more blindness. The house was not a sanctuary anymore. It was a battlefield. And if his son thought he had claimed victory, he was wrong. As the night deepened, the father lit a single lamp in the study. The light fell across stacks of ledgers, old tax returns, letters his wife had filed neatly in boxes. He spread them across the desk, determined to dig for answers. Hours passed as he flipped through numbers, hunting for patterns. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as if the very walls leaned closer, urging him on. By midnight his eyes burned, his shoulders ached, but he found them small transfers hidden under layers of transactions, money siphoned in clever increments. He sat back in his chair, the room spinning slightly, but he no longer felt helpless. The betrayal was real, the emptiness suffocating, but pride flickered in him still. He had built before. He could build again. He had been underestimated, and now he would use that. The echo of his wife's voice seemed to brush past him, not comforting this time, but steadying, reminding him that she had always believed in his strength. He closed the file, exhaled, and stood. The silence of the house was still thick, but it no longer felt like defeat. It was the calm before a storm he was ready to unleash. And as he shut off the lamp, leaving the house cloaked once more in shadows, one question throbbed in his mind, relentless and consuming. If this home could still remember everything it once sheltered, would it stand with him when the final confrontation arrived, or would it crumble under the weight of the truth waiting to explode? He paused at the hallway table where her picture stood in its silver frame, the one polished so often that it gleamed even in the half-light. His fingers hovered over the glass, careful not to smudge the smile forever frozen there. He leaned in close, his voice low and steady, as though she might still hear him. He told her he was on his way to see their boy and the grandson she had adored, that he was keeping the promise he had made the night she died to stay present, to never drift away from family, no matter how heavy the grief became. The whisper trembled in the still air, swallowed by silence. But he felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. It was both comfort and torment, a reminder that his loyalty had outlived her, stretching now into a world where she no longer stood beside him. The house seemed to hold its breath with him as he pulled on his overcoat. He could still recall the last time she had reminded him of that promise, her hand squeezing his with surprising strength from the hospital bed, her eyes sharper than the pain in her voice. Family first, she had said, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He carried those words like scripture, repeating them now as armor. Tonight he would sit at the table with his son, smile at the grandson, who still called him Pop, with innocent joy, and he would bury the truth clawing at his chest. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around him, sharp enough to sting his lungs. The sky stretched wide and black, pricked with faint stars, and for a moment he wondered if she might be one of them, watching to see if he followed through. He locked the door and walked to his car, each step measured, deliberate, as though the pavement itself might sense the weight of what he carried. The drive was not long, but every red light felt endless. He rehearsed the mask he would wear at dinner, testing the smile in the rearview mirror, practicing the warmth in his voice. A father and grandfather keeping his word. A man who could still play his part. When he arrived, the house blazed with light, its windows glowing like eyes in the dark. He sat for a moment at the curb, gripping the wheel, watching silhouettes move across the curtains. Inside, laughter drifted faintly. his grandson's high-pitched squeal echoing like music through the walls. His heart clenched, a reminder of why he was here. He shut off the engine, climbed out, and forced his body into motion. The door swung open before he knocked his grandson barreling into his arms with a shriek of joy. He lifted the boy high, spun him once, and felt warmth flood through him. The innocence of a child was still untouchable, still real. His son appeared behind the boy, smiling wide, though the father saw something else flicker in his eyes, something rehearsed like a man playing host at a dinner he hadn't paid for. The father smothered the thought, let the boy cling to his neck, and allowed himself to be pulled inside. The air smelled of roasted chicken and garlic, the kind of meal meant to feel homey and grounding. He sat at the table, his grandson sliding onto the chair beside him, chattering about a soccer game. The boy's words spilled out, quick, unfiltered, pure. He listened, nodding, smiling, soaking it in. For those moments loyalty felt easy, natural, as though the world had not shifted beneath his feet. But when his son refilled his glass and placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of the lawyer's call earlier that day pressed harder. The betrayal lay coiled under the table, unseen, but alive, twisting in the space between them. He answered his son's questions, laughed at practiced jokes, but his chest burned with the knowledge that each smile was built on lies. Still, he remembered his wife's words. Family first, even when it's hard. The evening stretched on a blur of plates and stories, his grandson tugging at his sleeve to show a drawing, his son's wife complimenting his suit. He nodded, smiled, played the part with such precision that even he might have believed it, if not for the stone lodged in his gut. When dessert was served, his grandson leaned against him, drowsy from sugar, and he wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders. In that quiet moment, with the hum of conversation in the background, he whispered again to his wife in the stillness of his mind, "I'm here. I kept my word." Yet beneath the tenderness a shadow stirred. He realized that loyalty was no longer enough, that the promise he had carried like scripture might soon demand something more. To protect the grandson who trusted him blindly, to honor the woman who had believed in his strength, he would need to become more than a presence at the table. He would need to act. He tucked the boy into bed later, smoothing the covers, brushing hair from his forehead. He kissed the child goodnight, the gesture automatic but heavy with meaning. As he stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, he felt the weight of another kind of promise forming in his chest, unspoken but undeniable. The house was quieter now. Dishes stacked in the sink, his son pouring another glass of wine in the kitchen. The father paused in the hallway, the glow from the living room light stretching across the polished floor. He studied the reflection staring back at him in the glass cabinet door, the face of a man who had given everything, still keeping a vow to a woman long gone, still smiling for a child who deserved better. But loyalty had its limits. Dedication, once his strength, could turn into a weapon if wielded carefully. He straightened his shoulders, smoothed his tie again, and walked back into the light. And as he rejoined the table, hiding the storm behind calm eyes, one thought seared through him like fire. When the truth finally surfaced, when masks fell and betrayal stood naked in the open, would loyalty save his family, or would it destroy everything that remained? The phone buzzed against the polished wood of the entryway table, its vibration breaking through the hush of the house. He smiled at first, certain it was his son, perhaps reminding him not to forget dessert or teasing him about being late again. His hand reached without hesitation, but the screen glared back with a name that made the air shift cold around him. It wasn't his son. It wasn't family. It was his lawyer. The man who only called when there was something too heavy for paper, too dangerous for delay. He hesitated before answering, his thumb hovering over the screen. A knot formed in his stomach, an instinct older than reason. He lifted the phone to his ear, and the voice that came through was clipped, urgent, the kind of tone that stripped away the pretense of small talk. The lawyer told him to sit down. He obeyed without thinking, lowering himself onto the bench beneath the staircase, his coat still half draped over one arm. His pulse quickened as the words came fast, precise, and devastating. The lawyer didn't begin with pleasantries. He spoke of numbers, transfers, accounts that should have been untouched, now drained. He spoke of forged signatures, hidden authorizations, and documents so convincing they could only have been created by someone who knew his routines intimately. The father's breath caught in his throat as the name was spoken, the betrayal confirmed. It wasn't strangers. It wasn't outsiders. It was his son. The silence that followed was deafening. His eyes drifted upward to the family portraits on the wall, each frame now a mockery of trust. He remembered his son at 12 beaming proudly after hitting his first home run, the dirt still smudged across his cheeks. He remembered the night his wife whispered that their boy would grow into a man worth every sacrifice. Those memories had been his anchor. Now they burned like acid, leaving scars in their place. The lawyer's voice pulled him back, steady but insistent. He was warned not to confront, not yet. To smile, to sit through dinner, to let his son believe the performance was working. Surveillance was in place, documentation gathering like storm clouds. The lawyer promised the truth would have its day. But for now, the father must act. Normal, grateful, blind. He ended the call with a hand that shook more than he wanted to admit. The phone slipped slightly as he set it down. His reflection fractured in the black screen. He looked at himself and barely recognized the man staring back. A man robbed not only of money, but of faith. He drew a breath so deep it rattled in his chest and forced himself to stand. His knees cracked, his back stiffened, but the mask he would wear had to be flawless. As he adjusted his coat and reached for the keys, the house seemed to resist him, its silence heavier than ever. Each step toward the door was like walking into a stage set, knowing the script but loathing every line. Outside, the night air carried the faint scent of cut grass and distant smoke, ordinary details that now felt sharpened by the knowledge he carried. He slid into the driver's seat of his car and gripped the wheel, the leather pressing into his palms. His reflection in the windshield looked like a ghost caught between two worlds, the father who had trusted blindly and the man who now knew. The drive blurred around him. Streetlights smeared into streaks of gold. He barely noticed the turns, the stop signs, the rhythm of traffic. His mind replayed the lawyer's words on a loop, each repetition cutting deeper. Forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, shell companies. His son's name tied to them all. He imagined his wife's face if she could hear this truth. The disappointment would have shattered her, and perhaps in that moment he was glad she was gone, spared the cruelty of knowing. When he arrived at his son's house, the gates opened smoothly, the glow spilling out from the windows like a portrait of domestic bliss. He sat for a moment, engine idling, listening to its low hum, grounding himself. He could see movement through the curtains, the silhouettes of his son and daughter-in-law setting the table, the faint dance of shadows on the wall. A normal family scene, carefully curated, perfectly false. He killed the engine, stepped out, and walked toward the front door. His hand hovered over the doorbell, and for an instant he imagined turning away, leaving it all behind. But his wife's voice returned to him, sharp and steady from the past. Family first, even when it's hard. He pressed the bell, and the sound rang out into the night. The door opened, and his son greeted him with a practiced warmth, the same smile that once filled him with pride. The father smiled back, but behind it his heart pounded like a war drum. He stepped inside, into the glow of chandeliers and the scent of roasted chicken, into the performance of loyalty that would carry him through the night. And as the laughter of his grandson echoed down the hallway, mingling with the clink of dishes and the murmur of shallow conversation, one question lodged itself in his mind, unshakable and merciless. How long could he wear this mask before the truth erupted and shattered everything in its path? The word cut through him like a knife. Urgent. His lawyer had never used it casually, never allowed it to slip past his lips without gravity. That single word carried weight heavier than years of court filings or contracts stacked high in polished cabinets. It froze him where he stood, his coat still in one hand, the house behind him yawning in silence. He sat back down on the bench beneath the staircase, his heart hammering so loud it felt as though the walls might echo it back. The lawyer's voice on the other end did not soften. It pressed forward, relentless, layering detail upon detail, each one colder than the last. There had been signatures perfectly mimicked, transfers executed with the kind of precision only an insider could know. Accounts moved, funds drained, the meticulous work of someone who understood exactly how to exploit his trust. His lawyer spelled it out without pause. Someone had staged this theft carefully, systematically, and the trail pointed straight to his son. His throat went dry, his breath caught, but he forced himself to keep listening. The numbers blurred, but the betrayal sharpened, cutting with clarity. Millions gone. Documents falsified. A betrayal crafted not in haste, but over time cultivated like a harvest of deceit. Fear wrapped itself around him, cold and unrelenting. It was more than the loss of money. It was the unraveling of a bond he had once believed unbreakable. His mind flared with images: his son's first day of school, his first scraped knee, the nights he stayed up holding the boy after nightmares. Those memories stood now in stark contrast to the truth. The lawyer's words still hung between them, urgent. The storm had already broken, and the winds of it threatened to tear apart not only his finances but the very foundation of his family. He pressed his hand against his chest as though he could calm the thundering inside. He wanted to shout, to demand explanations, to deny that this could be real. But the evidence was there, and his lawyer spoke with the kind of finality that left no room for disbelief. He was told to keep still, to breathe, to act as though nothing had changed. He must go to dinner as planned. Must smile, must play the role of a man blissfully unaware of his son's treachery. If he confronted too soon, everything would scatter into the wind, proof, lost accounts emptied beyond recovery. The father nodded, though no one could see him forcing air back into his lungs. His lawyer's voice dropped lower, more urgent still. They had a plan, but it required patience, a performance, and trust in the process. The father hated every word of it. Pretend to trust the son who had gutted him. Pretend to love without suspicion. Pretend not to know. It felt like swallowing poison. But he agreed because he had no choice. When the call ended, the silence returned louder than before. He looked around his house, once his kingdom, now a stage where deceit had been rehearsed under his nose. He ran a hand across his face, feeling the weight of years press into the lines etched there. He had worked every hour offered to him to build a life of security, to create a future for his family. And with one word, urgent, he realized that future had been stolen. He rose slowly, forcing strength into his spine. The storm was here, but storms had never broken him before. He had weathered layoffs, recessions, the death of his wife, and the hollow nights of grief that followed. He could weather this too, though it might carve him deeper than anything else had. He slipped his coat on, squared his shoulders, and stepped out into the night. The drive felt unreal, as though he were floating through a world slightly askew. The glow of streetlights seemed too bright, the shadows between them too sharp. His hands clutched the wheel knuckles white, but his mind churned with thoughts faster than the tires turned. What would he say when he saw his son? How would he keep his voice steady? How could he hold his grandson in his arms and not feel the sour taste of betrayal hanging between them? When he reached the neighborhood, the houses gleamed with their curated perfection. Perfect lawns, trimmed hedges, the hum of wealth vibrating through the air. His son's house stood at the center of it all, grand and immaculate, lit like a stage prepared for the evening's performance. He pulled into the driveway and sat there for a long moment, his chest heavy with dread. He imagined walking inside, imagined the warmth of his grandson's hug, the rehearsed smiles of his son and daughter-in-law. He imagined laughter around the table, every sound sharpened now by the knowledge of theft. He drew a long breath, steadying himself. The word urgent repeated in his mind like a metronome, each beat a reminder that everything had shifted. He could not allow his son to see the crack in his armor. He could not stumble. He had to be flawless. He stepped out of the car, each motion deliberate, and walked toward the glowing door. His grandson's voice carried faintly from inside, calling for his father, innocent and unaware. The sound twisted the knife in his chest, but he forced a smile as the door opened. His son greeted him with warmth, his arms wide, his words sweet. To anyone else it might have seemed real, but the father saw it differently now. Every gesture looked rehearsed, every glance calculated. He embraced his son, held his grandson, accepted a drink from his daughter-in-law, and slid into his chair at the table. He performed. He listened to stories, laughed where expected, nodded with practiced ease. Inside, though, he replayed the lawyer's words, each detail etched into his bones. Forged signatures, drained accounts, betrayal carried out by blood. The meal passed in a blur of flavors he could not taste, of voices that sounded far away. His eyes lingered on his son, searching for a crack in the mask. A slip of guilt, anything. But his son wore his role with skill, confident, certain of his power. The father felt the heat of fear grip him again, but he held steady, keeping the mask secure. Later, as he drove home through the dark streets, the word urgent still echoed in his head. He tightened his grip on the wheel and whispered into the night, not to his son, not to his lawyer, but to his wife's memory. He promised her he would see this through. He would not allow their family name to be torn apart without a fight. And as the night stretched ahead, heavy and endless, he knew one truth with piercing clarity: this storm would not simply pass. It would consume everything until only one side remained standing, and the question that burned in his chest was whether his son understood the force of the father he had chosen to betray. The words struck harder than any blow he had ever taken. Millions gone. Not misplaced, not miscalculated, gone. His lawyer's voice was deliberate, each sentence edged with the sharpness of proof. Transfers authorized under his name. Signatures that mimicked his hand so perfectly, even he would have sworn they were his own. Companies he had never heard of, accounts buried behind layers of deception, all siphoning from the fortune he had built. The fortune that was supposed to secure his grandson's education, his family's stability, his own peace in old age. It had been gutted with precision. And then came the final blow, the one that hollowed him out in an instant. The man behind it wasn't a stranger, wasn't some faceless criminal. It was his son. The silence in the house roared in his ears, filling the space between his lawyer's words. He gripped the phone tighter, knuckles blanching, trying to anchor himself to something real. His son, the boy he had taught to ride a bike on cracked sidewalks. The boy he had driven to practice at dawn, sat in the stands, cheering even in the rain. The boy he had defended when teachers said he was too distracted, too restless, promising them he just needed time to grow. That boy had grown into a man who now stood at the center of this betrayal. He struggled to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His lawyer filled the silence, methodical, laying out the evidence that couldn't be denied. The pattern of withdrawals, the false assurances, the subtle diversions masked as investments. All roads led to his son. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't desperation. It was a plan executed over months, maybe years, while the father smiled across dinner tables, believing every word his son spoke. The heartbreak was physical. His chest tightened as though something inside him cracked under the pressure. He looked up at the photographs lining the hallway, faces frozen in innocence. His wife's smile on their wedding day. His son at 5 years old holding a toy truck with pride. His grandson blowing out candles, cheeks flushed with joy. Those images felt poisoned now, each one a reminder of the trust that had been weaponized against him. The disbelief was equally suffocating. He replayed conversations in his mind, searching for signs he had missed. The times his son insisted on managing the finances, the reassurances that the markets were volatile but under control, the subtle irritation whenever the father asked too many questions. It had been there plain as day if only he had looked harder. But trust had blinded him, and now trust had destroyed him. His lawyer told him again to stay calm, to act natural, to continue the performance of ignorance. They had gathered enough to build a case, but the trap wasn't ready to spring. If the son sensed suspicion, the last of the money would vanish beyond reach. The father nodded mutely, though rage burned under his skin. He wanted to storm into his son's home, slam the evidence onto the polished marble counter, and demand answers. He wanted to shout until the walls cracked, but instead he forced the rage down, burying it beneath layers of restraint. He hung up and sat in the darkness, the phone heavy in his hand. The house around him no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage where every scene he had believed in had been scripted against him. The furniture, the photos, the very walls seemed to lean in with accusation. He whispered his wife's name into the still air, his voice breaking as though she might somehow answer. But the silence gave nothing back. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. The neighborhood was calm, quiet families tucked into their lives, blissfully unaware. He wondered what they would say if they knew. Would they pity him? Would they call him blind? Would they shake their heads and whisper that he should have seen it coming? The thought twisted the knife deeper. But beneath the heartbreak, beneath the disbelief, something colder began to form. A clarity, sharp and unforgiving. He realized that love had shielded his son for too long, that forgiveness had been handed out in advance, that excuses had been made until they no longer meant anything. This was not a mistake to be forgiven. This was war declared silently across bank ledgers and forged documents. And if war had been chosen, then war was what his son would get. He turned away from the window and began pacing each step, grounding him further in the decision forming inside. His son had taken money, yes, but worse than that, he had taken faith. He had shredded the bond between father and son, and bonds like that could not be mended with apologies. The father knew there would be no quiet reconciliation, no gentle confrontation. This would demand something greater, something that would not just reclaim what was lost, but make his son understand the weight of betrayal. He sat at his desk, pulled out a yellow notepad, and began to write. Not numbers, not balances, but thoughts. Each line steadier than the last. He listed names of contacts, old allies and business people who still owed him favors. He mapped out timelines, resources, weak points. His son thought he was dealing with an old man too weary to fight back, but he had forgotten who built the empire in the first place. Every skyscraper his company had touched, every contract signed, every battle won. It had been the father's hand guiding it. Age had slowed him, but it hadn't stripped him of cunning. By the time the clock struck midnight, he had filled pages with plans. The rage still burned, the heartbreak still throbbed, but they no longer controlled him. He had found direction. His son had made the unthinkable choice, and now he would learn what it meant to cross a man who had nothing left to lose but the fight itself. As he blew out the lamp and let the house sink back into shadow, one thought seared itself into his mind. Relentless and unyielding, when the final reckoning came, would his son beg for forgiveness? Or would he realize too late that forgiveness was no longer part of the equation at all? The words echoed in his skull, relentless and sharp, carving through memory like glass splintering under pressure. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll handle it." They had been spoken so many times over the years in tones that once carried warmth, reassurance, pride. At the time, he had believed them, wanted to believe them, because a father longs for nothing more than to trust his son. But now those same words returned like blades, every syllable a weapon forged from deception. What once soothed him now felt toxic, dripping into the cracks of his soul with venom he could not wash away. He remembered the first time his son had said it years ago, when a burst pipe threatened to flood the basement in the dead of winter. His wife had been frantic, searching for towels, panicked at the rising water. But the boy, barely 20 then, had stepped forward, calm and confident, promising his father not to worry. He would handle it, and he did. He made the calls, organized the repairs, stood tall with a clipboard like a man already prepared to inherit the weight of responsibility. The father had felt his chest swell with pride that night, convinced he was seeing the beginnings of the man his son was destined to become. Years later, when the father had considered selling one of the properties to ease his workload, it was his son again who spoke with steady eyes. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll handle it." He had waved off the older man's concerns, reminded him that retirement should mean rest, not paperwork. The father had agreed, grateful for the chance to breathe. never realizing that each document he signed was another thread of the web being spun around him. Now, standing alone in the hollow quiet of his study, those words rattled in his skull like shackles. Every reassurance was no longer memory, but evidence proof of the trap laid with patience and precision. He could hear the tone of his son's voice, smooth, confident, rehearsed. It had been a lullaby masking betrayal, a siren song that led him straight to ruin. The realization sickened him. He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles whitened, his pulse hammering through his temples. He thought of his wife, how she had once looked at their son with eyes filled with admiration. She had always said the boy had his father's strength, and her wit, a combination destined to take him further than either of them could imagine. If she had lived to see this day to hear what the lawyer revealed, her heart would have broken in a way that no cure could mend. Perhaps it was mercy that she had been spared the truth, though the father could not decide if that mercy was for her or for his son. The memories kept coming uninvited like reels of film unspooling in the dark. His son asking for control of the accounts after his wife passed, his voice gentle, persuasive. "You shouldn't have to deal with this alone, Dad. Let me handle it." His son insisting the new investments were solid, his smile wide and reassuring. "You've done enough. I'll handle it." Each phrase struck now like a confession disguised as care, a mask of loyalty concealing theft. He wanted to hate his son, to erase every image of pride, every echo of laughter. But hate did not come easily. Instead, it was heartbreak that consumed him, the kind that lingered like smoke after fire. The betrayal had not only stolen his money, it had poisoned his memories, turning them into shadows that mocked him. His life's happiest moments were now riddled with suspicion, their sweetness soured by hindsight. He paced the study, the carpet muffling his steps, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He could almost hear his son's voice, still threaded through every corner of the room, promising again and again to handle it. The repetition felt like torment, as though the house itself conspired to remind him of his blindness. He stopped at the window, staring out at the night, his reflection superimposed on the dark glass. He saw not just himself, but the man he had raised, the boy who once fit in the curve of his arm. He whispered aloud, his voice trembling with both rage and grief. "You handled it all right. You handled it straight into ruin." The taste of bitterness filled his mouth. He knew he could not remain here, trapped in memory. Memories were weapons now, but weapons could also be sharpened, wielded. If his son had turned trust into a tool for destruction, then the father would turn betrayal into a weapon of his own. He would take every reassurance, every lie, and use them to fuel his resolve. The lamp on his desk cast long shadows stretching across the room like scars. He sat again, pulled the notepad closer, and began writing. Not lists this time, but recollections, dates, conversations, details. Every instance when his son had asked him to step back, every time he had handed over responsibility. Each word became evidence, a breadcrumb trail of betrayal laid bare in ink. His hand shook but did not stop. The record grew page by page until it felt less like memory and more like testimony. When he finally set the pen down, his body trembled with exhaustion, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. He stared at the pages and knew they were more than just notes. They were the foundation of his counterattack, the beginning of the structure he would build to dismantle what his son had constructed. His memories, once poisoned, now had purpose. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, and closed his eyes. He could still hear the words that once comforted him, now twisted beyond repair. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll handle it." The venom of betrayal lingered in those syllables, but beneath it a fire stirred. If those words had been turned into knives, then he would forge armor from the scars they left behind. The night stretched deep around him, the silence humming with unease. He opened his eyes, fixed on the darkness beyond the window, and let a single thought crystallize in his mind, steady and unrelenting when the final confrontation came, when father and son stood face to face with the truth laid bare, whose words would be remembered as weapons and whose would become the verdict that ended it all. His lawyer's warning still echoed in his ears long after the call ended. "You must act normal. Smile. Don't let him know." The words felt like shackles binding him to a role he had never chosen. He stood in the dim light of his hallway, staring at his reflection in the mirror, practicing the face of a man who had no reason to suspect his own son had gutted him. The corners of his mouth lifted, but the expression never reached his eyes. Behind the glass he saw not the father he had once been, but an actor rehearsing a part written by betrayal. The drive to his son's house was suffocating. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Each stoplight felt like a test, daring him to turn around to abandon the performance and storm into his son's life with the truth. But he kept going mile after mile until the glowing house appeared ahead like a stage lit for an audience. His son's home was immaculate, every hedge trimmed, every light perfectly placed the image of success. Yet to the father it now looked like a set, the backdrop of a play where he had been cast as the fool. The door opened before he could knock. His grandson's laughter rang out, piercing the heaviness for an instant, and small arms wrapped around his waist. He bent down, scooping the boy up, his smile real for the first time all evening. The innocence of a child remained untouched, pure, untainted by greed. He held the boy close, inhaling the scent of crayons and soap, clinging to the one truth that hadn't been stolen from him. But then his son appeared, framed in the doorway, his smile wide, his eyes bright with the ease of a man who believed himself secure. The father felt his chest tighten. He forced his face into warmth, clapping his son on the shoulder, letting his voice carry the casual cadence of comfort. Inside the house gleamed with chandeliers, polished stone, and the faint aroma of garlic and roasted chicken. He told himself to take it all in, to memorize every detail, because this was the empire built on his ruin. Dinner began like every other. Plates clinked, voices overlapped, his daughter-in-law poured wine with a practiced grace. They asked about his health, about the old house, about whether he was keeping busy. Their words felt rehearsed questions, tossed like props to maintain the illusion of family harmony. He answered carefully, his voice steady, his laugh well-timed, his posture relaxed. He heard his lawyer's warning again, smile, and so he smiled. But every movement was a lie. His heart beat against his ribs like a prisoner pounding on cell doors. As the conversation drifted to vacations and investments, he studied his son. The confidence in his tone, the way he leaned back in his chair, the glances exchanged with his wife. It was the performance of a man who thought he had outsmarted everyone. The father sipped his wine, letting the bitter taste anchor him. He wanted to slam the glass down, to demand wide a scream that he knew, but he kept his face still, his eyes soft, nodding as though each lie were gospel. His grandson tugged at his sleeve, holding up a crayon drawing of a rocket ship. The father bent down, praising it with enthusiasm, his voice breaking only slightly. The child's laughter wrapped around him, but even that joy carried a sting. He knew this little boy's future was being gambled away by the very man who now carved chicken at the head of the table. Every second of the meal was agony. Each time his son's hand brushed the wine bottle or adjusted his cufflinks, the father saw the thief beneath the surface. Every reassuring glance from his daughter-in-law felt like theater. He swallowed each bite without tasting it, his stomach twisted into knots. The lawyer's words were a constant drumbeat in his mind. Don't let him know. Later, when dessert was served, his son leaned closer, speaking with feigned concern about his father's health. Maybe it was time to simplify things, to let go of the old house, to trust him with the remaining assets. The father's jaw tightened, but his smile did not falter. He gave a soft laugh, brushing off the suggestion with the ease of a man too naive to suspect. Inside, though, rage burned so hot it threatened to set him alight. When the evening ended, he stood in the doorway, hugging his grandson one last time. His son clasped his hand firmly, looking him in the eye with a smile that to anyone else would have seemed genuine. The father returned it, his grip steady, his voice calm. Only when he walked back to his car, the door shutting behind him, did the mask begin to crack. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, staring at the house glowing behind him. His breaths came shallow, uneven, the weight of the evening pressing down like a stone. He had survived the first act of the performance, but the curtain had not yet fallen. The hardest part was still ahead, and he knew the play could not last forever. He would keep smiling, keep nodding, keep pretending, until the moment came when pretense would no longer be necessary. And as he drove into the night, the road stretching dark and endless before him, one question pulsed in his mind with brutal clarity. When the final mask slipped and the performance ended, who would still be standing when the truth tore the stage apart? He stood in the half-light of the bathroom, the mirror fogged slightly from the steam of a shower he barely remembered taking. The man staring back at him looked older than he had yesterday. His eyes were ringed with shadows, not just from fatigue but from years of grief compacted into something heavier, something raw. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched by betrayal as much as by time. He studied his reflection with the cold detachment of a man sizing up a stranger. For the first time he saw not a father, not a husband, not even a victim, but a survivor being forced into battle. The grief was still there, coiled in his chest, the memory of his wife's absence pressing like a thumb on a bruise that never healed. The betrayal lay beside it, jagged and merciless, the kind that seeped into his veins with every heartbeat. Yet as he stared at the reflection, a third force began to rise. Clarity. It came not with peace but with precision, like glass shattering and leaving edges so sharp they could cut through anything. The shock had burned away, leaving behind something more dangerous: resolve. He pressed his palms flat against the sink, leaning closer until his breath clouded the glass. His voice was low, steady, more promise than whisper. The performance begins now. The words tasted metallic, like blood and iron. He straightened, pulling his shoulders back, feeling the weight of age, but also the endurance that came with it. He had been underestimated. That was their mistake. He left the bathroom and walked the hall of his empty house, each step echoing like a drumbeat. The silence no longer mocked him, it fueled him. He had built this place brick by brick, beam by beam, not just as a shelter, but as proof of what his hands and mind could accomplish. If he could build this, he could rebuild everything else. His son thought betrayal had ended him, but it had only forged him harder. In the study, he reopened the notepad he had filled the night before. Pages lined with scribbles, names, numbers, fragments of plans. He turned each page slowly as though testing the weight of his own intentions. This was no longer just about recovering money. It was about reclaiming dignity, about making his son understand the cost of treachery. Every smile he would wear at that dinner table, every nod of trust, would be ammunition. He would play the fool until the day came to reveal the truth, and when it came, the fallout would be absolute. But inside him, another war brewed. One side screamed for confrontation, for the primal satisfaction of tearing the mask off his son's face and watching the lies collapse in real time. The other side whispered caution, reminding him of the lawyer's warning of the trap that needed time to be set. Rage demanded action. Reason demanded patience. He paced the room, fists clenching and unclenching, torn between the father who wanted answers and the strategist who wanted victory. The war within was not just about his son. It was about himself. He had been a man defined by loyalty, by the steady rhythm of sacrifice. He had worked double shifts, missed vacations, carried debts, all to ensure his family thrived. Now that loyalty had been weaponized against him, turned into shackles. The man in the mirror had forced him to ask, was he still the father, willing to bear every burden, or had betrayal transformed him into something else, something colder, sharper, more dangerous? He sat back down at the desk, his breathing steadying. He thought of his grandson, the boy's arms around his neck, the laughter that still echoed in his ears. That child deserved better than to inherit the greed festering in his parents' veins. For him, this performance could not fail. He would endure the mask, the lies, the dinners filled with false smiles, because one day the boy would need to see the truth that his grandfather had not been broken but reborn in fire. He picked up the pen again, writing slower now, more deliberate. Contacts who could be trusted, accounts that could be checked discreetly, properties that had not yet been touched. He mapped each detail with precision, each line on the paper a step closer to reclaiming what was his. The rage was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It had been caged, chained, and harnessed into something useful. Hours slipped past unnoticed. By the time he set the pen down, the sun was bleeding into the horizon, staining the sky with streaks of red and gold. He stood at the window, watching the light shift, feeling a calm unlike any he had known in days. The war inside him had not ended, but it had found balance. Grief and betrayal still lived in him, but clarity now stood beside them, guiding him forward. He whispered once more to his wife's photograph as he passed it in the hall. "I'm ready." The words did not tremble this time. They landed heavy, certain, final. He picked up his coat, adjusted his tie, and stepped out the door. The performance had already begun, and with every passing moment he could feel the mask fitting tighter, the stage being set. And as the night swallowed him whole, one question burned hotter than the rest, carving itself into his mind like scripture. When the final curtain rose, would his son recognize the man he had tried to break? Or would he only see the destroyer he had unknowingly created? Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from family. But even in the ashes of heartbreak, there are lessons worth carrying forward. This story reminds us that blind trust, while born from love, can leave us vulnerable when those closest to us lose their way. For older generations, it is a call to balance loyalty with caution, to protect what we have worked for without surrendering to naivety. It shows the power of endurance, that even in grief and betrayal, clarity can emerge and resolve can turn pain into strength. More importantly, it is a reminder that age does not strip us of our ability to fight back, to adapt, and to reclaim dignity. For seniors who have sacrificed much, this lesson is clear: never underestimate your own resilience. Guard your legacy, cherish your wisdom, and know that even when deceived, you hold the power to rise stronger than before. If this message resonates with you, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and your story might just inspire someone else walking through the same storm.